Hell, I'm so excited for this. Stick around because our guest today we have a very special guest, Temple Stewart. Temple is a registered dietitian on a mission to guide and empower women in their weight loss journey through the transformative power of a ketogenic lifestyle. She earned her degree in dietetics at the University of Tennessee and honed her skills during her internship at the VA Medical Center. In addition to her experience in nutrition, Temple is a certified personal trainer and a health behavior change specialist. I'm so excited for this. I'm here with Temple. Temple Stewart, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again. This is going to be fun. I'm excited to chat.
I should have said welcome back, right? So, how are
Yeah.
you? How are things? What's what are you been busy with these days?
Yeah, things have been really good. Still, a lot of people needing a
Mhm.
lot of help. Since we talked last, I moved to Phoenix, Arizona. I'm in med school to become a
Mhm.
naturopathic doctor. So that's been a huge change. Definitely keeping me
Wow.
very busy in conjunction with my two kiddos. So, yeah, lots of fun stuff happening.
Wow. I didn't know that. That was That's amazing.
Yeah, I'm excited. It'll be fun.
Big moves, big moves. Um, so yeah, Temple here, she's not new to the podcast. Actually, we had a recorded podcast about almost 2 years ago. We were talking about this before we went live. That's episode 58. If you want to listen to that, we talked about the miracles of the ketogenic diet in Temple's life and how she reversed PCOS, Hashimoto's, and all that stuff. So today we'll get a chance to dig in a little deeper into these topics. But first, would love to have her tell the story, right? So Temple,
Yeah.
what's the story and what's your backstory and how this all came to be?
Yeah, great question. So I grew up in South Mississippi, very, very rich, heavy, high fat, high sugar foods. And so I was always kind of like the chunky kid, right? I always had a little bit of weight to lose. I always was a little bit heavier than my peers. I didn't think much of it. Obesity is definitely a thing all over the country, not just in the South. And it really didn't start kind of wearing on me until I was in college. So I grew up an athlete. I played every sport in the book. I ran track, I played soccer, basketball. I did the whole thing when I was young. And I think that level of activity really kind of kept me from going or getting really, really overweight. And so I'm grateful for that, but I think it also masked a lot of the symptoms and or maybe hormonal dysregulation things that I had going on. So anyway, fast forward to college. I'm playing college soccer. And that's when things really started to get a little bit weird for me. So I started to have issues with my cycle. I gained
Mhm.
probably 20 to 30 pounds while being a, Division 1 athlete, which was kind of was weird in itself because, I'm lifting weights, I'm doing all this extreme activity and playing soccer every single day. Why, how am I gaining weight with no real dietary
Mhm.
changes? And so I went to go see a nurse there at the school, and then they essentially did the whole thing like, oh, you're having problems with your period because you're an athlete, like let's just throw you on some birth control, hopefully that will regulate it. And so I
Mhm.
did that. I didn't know any better. I was young and I was like, okay, well, if it helps, it helps. And so anyway, fast forward a little bit from there. I should say the birth control didn't really help anything. If anything, it probably helped me gained a little bit more weight. And so I kept kind of struggling through college with my weight, my period cycles, my moodiness. I was definitely having some symptoms of PCOS at that time. I was having cystic acne and oily skin, all of it. And I that's when I developed my love for nutrition, although I didn't put two and two together, right? So I just kind of figured out that I feel a little bit better when I eat better, and I'm able to play a little bit better, etc. And so that's when I started to pursue a career as a dietitian. So a little bit after college, I graduated, still kind of had the same issues. I went to an OBGYN, and because at this point I had gotten married and was wanting to have a child and was still really struggling, wanted to get off birth control, all of it. And I went to an OBGYN and they were basically like, oh, yeah, you're like classic PCOS person. Like you have every sign,
Mhm.
symptom, like here's some metformin, stay on the birth control. We'll add some spironolactone in there as well, and you're gonna need to have help when you want to get pregnant. And so come back, and we can start like the Clomid cycles and the IU, the whole 9 yards. And I left there thinking, my gosh, I'm a registered dietitian. Well, like, there's got to be some way that I can
Mm,
fix this without just leaning on
yeah.
these prescriptions. And so that was really kind of when the light bulb went off for me. I would say it was about a year or two after college. I was a student dietitian about to become a registered dietitian. And that's when I started looking up all the ways to, like, how can you treat PCOS without medication? How do you regulate hormones? What causes PCOS? And that's when I really figured out, oh my gosh, this is diabetes of the ovaries. Like 90% of PCOS individuals have insulin resistance. It's just showing its face in a different way. And so that's when I got my hands on the book, The Obesity Code. And then pretty quickly after there, I got my hands on Why We Get Sick by Dr. Benjamin Bickman. And both of those were just tremendous in shaping the way
Mhm,
that I viewed nutrition and shaping the way that I healed myself. And
mhm,
so within a couple months of switching to a ketogenic style diet, my period returned. I was losing a ton of weight. I
mhm,
felt my energy levels come back. I was able to sleep through the night. Just everything that I had been trying to treat with normal standards, with normal dietary guidelines. I even dabbled in veganism a little bit. Nothing
mhm.
was helping until I
Yeah.
went keto, and everything changed at that point.
Mm, yeah, yeah, that was the story. We all know that keto is the answer. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
So I want to break this down for people. But first, I want to listen because I was listening back to our interview back then, and you expressed, looking back in those years playing in college, right? Not discovering keto sooner because this like that likely slowed you down, right? PCOS and
Yeah.
stuff, and we talked about being given birth control pills. I mean, how crazy is that, right? So this is why we're doing this. Hopefully someone finds this sooner rather than later, right? But how do you
Yeah.
think keto might have affected your career back then if you had
Oh.
found keto sooner?
Oh, 100, everything. Like, I think back to even just down to when I think about my college years, I had a ton of fun. I had great friends. I loved where I went to school, but there was a
Mhm,
lot of like mental health struggles. There's a lot of self-esteem issues as well.
mhm,
I had a really hard time, like, again with that. I finally realized, like, I am bigger than my peers. I way more, etc. And I remember always really struggling with like the mood stuff that came alongside insulin resistance and some of the depression like symptoms, and the oily skin and the cystic
mhm,
acne, and my hair was falling out. I was just having all of these, like, when you just feel kind of gross. That's how I felt.
mhm,
I felt kind of gross and just kind of like, I don't feel well. My energy levels sucked. Like, insulin resistance will rob you of so much energy, will give you so
mhm,
much fatigue. And so I just remember like everything being harder for me than it was for my peers. And
mhm,
and I was having to like drum up all this fake energy. I wasn't sleeping good. I had mood issues, all these things. And I look back like, oh, I would have maybe been able to perform better on the field for sure. If I was 20, 30 pounds lighter, that
mhm.
is tremendously
Yeah.
helpful when you're playing a endurance sport like soccer. And so I think of those things, but then I'm also like, you know what? If I hadn't have gone through all of that, hadn't have had that frustration with the conventional or
Yeah.
medical system, if I hadn't have experienced what pretty much 99% of women with PCOS experience when it comes to their diagnosis, I may not have such a passion for
Mhm,
helping others with it,
mhm.
because
Yeah.
it really did directly affect me. And I was so frustrated when I found out, like, oh, this is
Yeah.
not as complex as we've made this. Like, there's a lot of nutrition that can really help you handle it.
Yeah, and you telling that story tells that even that youngsters are going through that right now, right? And not just women, in this stage of their life, but I hope that your story, goes out and it becomes viral because I want every kid who suffers from PCOS to know that you don't have to be on birth control, right? So uh, also, I
Yeah.
wanna I wanna get to ask you here. After your college years, you were faced with, you said PCOS, and we already talked about this before, but I believe that It has to be said again. So the doctors prescribe you birth control and metformin for PCOS, right?
Mhm. And
How did you react to
spironolactone
that?
too. At the time I was ignorant to what at the time I really didn't understand that birth control is absolutely a band-aid and will oftentimes make things worse because then you're not able
Mm,
to identify true symptoms. It's really just like it's a mask. It's truly a mask. Same thing with metformin. Like I'm a fan of metformin in general. Like I think it's an extremely great, helpful medication. But I'm much more a fan of changing these things, nutrition and
mhm,
lifestyle, right? And so I was really frustrated. And at the time I think I was 20 or 21, and I was thinking, golly, why am I being given a diabetes medication? That was
mhm,
really one of the first kind of things that clicked in my mind was, okay, this is interesting. Like they treat PCOS with metformin. That
mhm,
must mean that I have some sort of blood glucose issue. And that's really when I dove in and figured out, oh, shoot, like this is literally insulin resistance of the ovaries. Like, and
mhm,
then, and going back to what you said about kids and disease rates, and I know your audience knows this, but the disease rates for insulin resistance in children are staggering. And there's no way to say that in a
mhm.
doing get playing its part of what it really is. Fatty non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is showing up in children's and sometimes in toddlers,
Wow.
and I don't even know how to explain how horrific the consequences of that is, because those just children are going to struggle for the rest of their life with some of this stuff if they don't get on it quickly. Parents as well. And same thing with PCOS. Like women with PCOS are like 50 to 60% more likely to get type 2 diabetes by the time they're 40.
Mhm,
They're way more likely to have gestational diabetes. They're way more likely to suffer preeclampsia in pregnancy, which is horrifically dangerous
mhm,
and scary. And all of these things. And I just remember being hit with a wave of information when I first got this diagnosis. And I remember thinking, oh, this is not going to be me. Like, and I want, I really am adamant about preaching that message is you can take care of this. There's hope in reversing non-alcoholic fatty liver and PCOS and type 2 diabetes and hypertension and all these things that are chronic diseases that we're told, oh, they're not reversible.
mhm,
You're just going to have to live with this. And that's just not true in any
mhm.
way.
So if somebody's dealing with this right now at a very young age, what was the first signs of PCOS for you so that we can help them, diagnose
Yeah.
themselves?
Great question. So oftentimes it will go unnoticed in especially younger children, maybe because it's like, oh, well, they just haven't gotten their period yet or something like that. But
Mhm,
some of the classic PCOS signs are amenorrhea or absence of period, and or
mhm,
periods that just aren't happening normally. Like maybe they'll have a longer bleed week, or they'll go separate for, they'll have 2 months in between their periods, or maybe it's very short. So the period stuff can be all over the place, but some classic signs as well is going to be
mhm,
cystic acne. So women with PCOS often get that really deep seated acne that's not just like a pimple that you can just pop and get rid of. It's like pimples under your skin. It's really awful. A lot of times they'll lose hair on their head, but grow it on their face, which is also horrific
mhm,
for females. They're getting chin hair, and they're having some PCOS women are having to shave and all these other things, but at the same time, they're losing a lot of their thickness in their hair.
mhm,
Your labs will oftentimes indicate there's some deviations happening. Like it's very easy to spot insulin resistance, high triglycerides, low HDL, high fasting insulin, glucose starts to be elevated, A1C starts creeping up there,
mhm,
children with hypertension and things like that are kind of classic red flags. But yeah, some of the first symptoms I would say too is just maybe weight gain kind of out of the blue, and or inability to lose weight as well as your peers. So like I remember thinking, oh, like if I just lower my calories and, eat the typical whole grain, lots of like legumes and all that, and lots of fruit and stuff, I'll be fine. And that really didn't actually help. But in fact, I would
mhm,
argue that it may have made my blood glucose dysregulation worse in a lot of ways. So yeah, those are kind of the first things you'll spot. And then of course, like if a child or family or a mother maybe that's listening, or a dad knows that there's like genetics for PCOS. If the mother had the PCOS, the
mhm,
children are much more likely to have it as well. And so just kind of knowing that ahead of times, if the mom had gestational diabetes, the child may be at a higher risk for blood glucose or
mhm,
fasting insulin or insulin resistant issues. So that was a long-winded answer to that question, but there's definitely signs and you can spot them
mhm.
for sure.
What would you have done differently if you were to go back then? Because, if you go to your doctor, we all know what happens, right? Obviously,
Yeah.
you can't just switch your diet, right? Because they might give you, medication, right? So, what
Yeah.
what would you have done differently?
So, I think what I would have done differently if I could have talked to my, like, 18, 17, 18-year-old self, I would have told myself, "You it starts with a diet." Like,
Mhm.
medications in most scenarios, especially with insulin resistance, that can absolutely be helpful, but you're never gonna be able to overcome a bad diet.
Mhm.
And that's especially true nowadays. Like, people are getting on all these semaglutides, Wegovy, Mounjaro, all that, and I think there's a place for those medications, but if you're using those medications and thinking that that's going to save you from eating like crap, it's just not. And so
Mhm.
I would have told myself, and I didn't really eat horrifically bad. Like, I wasn't eating, I did eat quite a bit of fast food as a kid, but in college, I really tried to do, wraps and, like I mentioned, all the whole grain stuff and granola cereal for
Yeah.
breakfast. And, like, I tried to do the conventional healthy diet. But I would have definitely changed my diet first. I would have also probably considered what I was doing exercise wise. Like, I think all that exercise was great for me in terms of
Mhm.
helping me stay at a not healthy weight, but not going fully obese. But I do think some of those exercise, very rigid, sometimes we were doing 2 a days or 3 a days. I think some of that probably wasn't helpful for my cortisol levels. Not that I would have ever quit
Mhm.
soccer, but maybe I would have just recognized the need for rest better. I definitely would have prioritized sleep. We know that if you sleep less than 7 or so hours, your blood glucose goes to that of a pre-diabetic. And I can think,
Mhm.
and most people in college would say that they weren't sleeping great, or are out doing all the things. And so I would have started there for sure. I would have started with my
Mhm.
diet. I would have started with really focusing on rest and stress reduction, and
Mhm.
really hyper focusing on taking care of
Mhm.
myself and prioritizing myself a little bit better.
For people who doesn't understand keto or how the body works, why is changing your diet so good for reversing PCOS?
Yeah, and I would add on to that reversing PCOS, but also reversing type 2 diabetes and fatty
Mhm.
liver and high blood pressure, the whole 9 yards, and obesity. Essentially, kind of a simpler way to put it is insulin is a very, very powerful hormone in the body. It has a lot of mechanisms. It controls a lot of different things. And when you are insulin resistant, it just means that the cells are not receiving the actions of that hormone properly, right? It means that
Mhm.
you have kind of cranked up blood glucose for so long and so much that your pancreas is releasing a lot of insulin and the cells just aren't really responding to it. And or they're responding to it in kind of the wrong way in terms of fat storage. So insulin is like the energy shuttling hormone. It When you overeat, when you overconsume carbohydrates and glucose, insulin has to do something with them. And so that's where you're going to get into the, higher triglycerides and higher fat storage and fatty liver disease and all of that, because insulin is forced to make moves, I would say,
Mhm.
and they're not always good if you're not in a healthy metabolic state. And so that's kind of the lowdown on insulin. Now, the problem with insulin resistance and PCOS is it also affects the cascade of hormones, right? It affects your androgens converting to estrogens, which leads to higher
Mhm.
androgen levels in women, and that's where you see a lot of the PCOS symptoms. That's where you see a lot of, like, the facial hair growth and the oily skin and the loss of hair on the head. A lot of women tend to pick up a lot of women with PCOS tend to have the male pattern obesity in terms, so, like, women without PCOS, if they're gaining weight, a lot of times that will be in, like, the thighs or the butt region, whereas women with PCOS, because they have more of a male pattern hormones and testosterone and androgen are high, tend to gain a lot of their weight in the visceral abdominal area, like men do typically. And so you'll see some of that as well. But that's essentially how insulin kind of affects it. Now, it'll affect everything, right? I shouldn't say everything, but insulin resistance can affect your thyroid hormones. It can affect your adrenals. It can affect testosterone and DHEA and all of estrogen, progesterone. So it's one of those hormones that really, when it's off, it's real off. And so can a lot of other things.
These are all great stuff for somebody who's going through this right now and wanting to change. But who can I approach about this, somebody that I could trust, who should I, first approach if I want to change?
Yeah, so I would say always start with your medical team. I should say that like none of this is medical advice. You have to be looked at on an individual basis, but understand that there's a very conventional way that they handle PCOS. So I would recommend somebody maybe if they have access to a naturopathic physician or
Mhm.
a health coach or a dietitian or someone like us that has an idea of what's happening and has an idea of how to fix these things with nutrition and lifestyle. That can be very, very helpful. Someone who has experience in this realm and or understands what to look for in labs and how to alter those labs with functional
Mhm.
foods and maybe even supplements. But I do think that naturopathic physicians are really fantastic in this realm, with endocrinology, and then also just finding a good fit for you and your personality.
Do you need a specialized? You do you need your doctor to point you to a naturopathic doctor, or can you just approach a naturopathic doctor?
Yeah, there's a lot of naturopathic doctors in the West. So I'm
Mhm.
out in Phoenix now. The Southeast struggles with
Mhm.
naturopaths. You won't find a ton of indies. They're there, but you can totally access some online, or
Mhm.
even some of the physicians that are well versed in keto. Like there's Dr. Tro and Dr. Brian
Yeah.
Linskis. There's tons of physicians online that
Mhm.
take telemedicine clients. Like I take telemedicine clients and can read labs and all of that. So there's a lot of options when it
Mhm.
comes to really kind of treating it on a natural level or nutrition and lifestyle level, I
Mhm.
should say.
I want to ask you though, if somebody wants to, absolutely, they know that keto is the way to go, or changing their lifestyle is the way to go. What should I do first before I approach somebody? Should I educate myself first? Should I go read a book, like you said? You read, the Obesity Code and Why We Get Sick by Dr.
Yeah.
Bickman. I want to ask, reflecting on, our interview, you did talked about that. I'm curious what specifically resonated with you in these books during that moment, because as a young dietitian back then, to make a decision to change your career must have been a huge change for you.
Yeah, so what I did know, I knew a couple things. I had enough experience working as a student dietitian in the diabetes clinic to understand
Mhm.
what we were doing was not working well.
Okay.
I just saw more and more veterans. I worked at a Veterans Affairs hospital in Florida, and I just saw I was doing a lot of nutrition counseling the way that I was taught in terms of carb counting and consistent carbohydrate, and these people weren't getting better. They were, in fact, I would
Mhm.
argue that a lot of times we were just slowing the demise a little bit. But we certainly weren't reversing A1Cs. And if we were, it was through very high doses of insulin and medications, which we know oftentimes causes a lot of weight gain and causes insulin resistance to come even faster. And so essentially I had had enough experience to know that the whole diet paradigm that I was taught as a dietitian, calories in versus calories out, and treating diabetes and insulin resistant conditions with consistent carbohydrates was an epic fail. And so I'd seen that in the clinic, I'd seen that in the hospital, but I'd also had an intimate experience with that in my own life. Like I was
Yeah.
not able to lose weight doing what I was taught. I was struggling. I was miserable. I hated my body. I had all these issues that I was really struggling with. And so when I read the obesity code, that was my first kind of like, okay, there's a different method. This makes total sense too. Like we're lowering insulin, we're lowering the fat storing hormone, and we're forcing fat storage to be used, etc. And then I read Dr. Bickman's book, which I think I talk about him on just nearly every podcast that I've been on because I think his book was really instrumental in my health journey in terms of laying out the science in a way that's easy to understand. And I mean, I feel like he taught me more in that book than I had learned, all through college and in my fellowship as a dietitian about how the body handles food and how most diseases that we see nowadays have at least some degree of relation to insulin resistance. Maybe they're not the cause or caused exactly by it, but they're certainly worsened. But even so, I would argue that most diseases are driven by, this insulin resistance and inflammation paradigm that we just kind of ignore in conventional medicine. So both of those books were really, they laid out the science in a
Mhm.
way that I felt was easy to understand and just made complete common sense to me.
Mm. There's such a divide between the conventional medicine and the alternative medicine that I say just changing your diet and changing your lifestyle. That's where people are so, confused because why isn't the conventional medicine catching up to this? For someone who isn't in the space, like if a client comes to you and confused, how do you approach that situation where your client is divided between like conventional medicine and then changing their diet?
Yeah, this
How
is a
how do you approach that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I see this a lot too when I'm having conversations with doctors and nurses and things like that, especially ones that have been taught and it's been very drilled in terms of like fear
Mhm.
fat, eat all the whole
Yeah.
grain things and all that. You know what? I really ask them a question. I'm like, has what you've been doing worked? Like, has it worked? Because the most, at least clients that I work with and women that I see have tried some sort of diet at some point in their life. You know what I'm saying? And so I just straight up ask them like, look, has this worked for you in the past? If so, why are you
Mhm.
reaching out to me? Why
Right.
are you struggling? And it really is. And same thing with physicians and nurses. They know, they see it. I was a dietitian in a hospital and saw it within a year of like, ooh, this isn't right. Like this isn't working. We're treating type 2 diabetics like they can handle carbohydrates and they can't.
Mhm.
And we're
Yep.
giving them medicine. So all of it is, if you sit and really look at it, it makes complete and perfect sense. The other thing that I have seen happen just by secondhand nature of working with different physicians and nurses, and this even started to happen in the VA, is the proof is in the pudding. It really is. I remember I was working at an outpatient clinic in the VA system. And so there's a lot of outpatient clinics, and then you have your main hospital. And essentially, I was getting such good results with these type 2 diabetics. These doctors were like, I don't know what this dietitian's doing, but like
Mhm.
send them there, send them there. And I was getting all these referrals all
Yeah.
over the board. I mean, I couldn't even physically keep up with the amount of referrals I was getting. And so that was helpful in sparking conversations because they were asking me, well, you're these patients need to get off insulin, et cetera. What are you doing? And I'm telling them, hey, I'm just telling them to cut back on
Mhm.
carbs and sugar and focus on protein and non-starchy vegetables, etc. And so I think once somebody sees the results, it's very hard to dismiss low carb
Right.
and keto as effective. It really is.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that sums it up, right? It's such a there's a lot of, agendas that happens in the background that for you to understand you really have to go back into history. Right, you have to
Yeah.
read that book by Nina Teckles. What's the book called?
Yeah. Fat some oh no, I hope I haven't forgot it. Yeah, but it's about essentially about fat fearing fat. I think it's
Yeah,
not fat
the big fat
fiction.
surprise. The big fat
Yes, the big
surprise.
fat surprise.
Anyways, I'm gonna link all the books that we
Yeah.
talked about here in the description box below, so you guys can check that out. Switching to keto. I always say it's simple, but it's not easy.
Mm-mm.
As you're a behavioral change specialist. Talk to me about like that and make creating a change for people because you have to understand there are years and years of condition. You cannot expect yourself to be an expert at this like off the bat.
Right. Yeah, it is hard. It's very hard because food goes so much more deeper
Mhm.
for most people than just nourishment, right? It's a
Yeah.
cultural thing. It's a habit thing. It treats our emotions. Some people are as far as addicted to it, and so food is it's like the tip of the iceberg, right? What you're
Mhm.
actually picking to eat is really the tip of the iceberg. There's psychological factors that play into it, and so there's all these different things that influence what we choose to eat and that shape what we choose to eat. And so every single person is a different individual and has different lived experiences that cause them to choose
Mhm.
certain things and a behavior and all of that. And so I think it's really important to understand that, especially as coaches or practitioners, or maybe there's clinicians listening. Like, every person is going to have a different nutrition history, and
Mhm.
really kind of getting to the deeper levels of why are we eating this way, what is causing this, why are we going on binges, why are we having 32-ounce sodas every day for lunch, and all these different things play into that. And so I think for each individual, what I do is I look at, okay, what's this person's biggest issue in terms of what are they doing that's hurting them the most. So
Mhm.
sometimes it could be somebody maybe going to Taco Bell and getting a soda habitually every single day for lunch because that's what their work schedule allows, and there's a
Mhm.
Taco Bell across the street. Okay, well,
Yeah.
let's address that first. And it's much harder to do a full overhaul of someone's diet unless they have that type of personality, kind of all or nothing style, than it is to kind of pick through. Okay, let's work on this change. Let's get rid of soda first and processed ultra processed carbs. Let's start
Mhm.
there, and then okay, now they may still be eating a little bit too much, whatever, quote unquote, healthy food, and then we work on that. And so it's all baby steps, right? And it's all
Mhm.
looking at that individual's
Yeah.
biggest issue and triaging it that way.
So do you look at their history of dieting? If they can do if they have to, cut back slowly, or if they can do cold turkey. Does that, all play in the
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, look at the history of dieting. Obviously, we have to take into consideration, like, is this individual on a lot of diabetes medications? If you cut
Mhm.
carbs and the individual's on insulin, you can get into some serious trouble. Same thing with high blood pressure medications, right? Like, if you have this individual that has all these chronic diseases and they're on high dose blood pressure medications,
Mhm.
pulling off carbs, keto is so effective, low carb is so effective that you can actually cause that person to have a hypotensive event. And so, or too low of a blood pressure. And so, all of that, of course, plays into it. But, most
Mm.
people have the goal of getting off medications and have never even thought that that was a reality for them until they've learned about low carb and keto. And that's
Mhm.
oftentimes one of the first things we do is work with the providers and pharmacists and MDs of, like, okay, this person is no longer, their blood pressure is actually going a little too low, like, what do we need to do now? And so, yeah, we look at dieting history, we look at cultural factors, we look at family life. A lot of times there's a support conflict, like maybe the wife really wants to change and the husband isn't on board, or maybe the husband
Right.
is on board and really wants to change, but the wife is really putting up some barriers around that. So there's a lot of dynamics when it comes to true change. And one thing I want to say to people too is it's okay to mess up. Like, it really, what matters is if you're headed in the right direction, you are likely going to have you're likely going to make a mistake. You're likely going to have a trigger episode, or choose a food that is not
Mhm.
necessarily moving you to your goals. It's really how you handle that mistake or that mess up or that decision versus it actually happening,
Mhm.
right? Like,
Mhm.
one salad doesn't make you skinny, just like, a pint of ice cream isn't going to make you gain a ton of weight. It's
Yeah.
really about consistency and habits, and the psychological aspect of this, I say, would be 80 to 90% of the whole thing, because it really is we make 200 plus food decisions a day on average.
Mm.
And a lot of those are unconscious. So it's very it can be tricky trying to help somebody navigate why they're making certain decisions, or what's driving them to eat a bag of chocolate at
Mhm.
night. Like, what are those kinds of things that we
Mm.
really need to focus on?
How much is the mental aspect of everything?
Oh
Like
man,
how
I would
yeah.
say it's more. I mean, back. I argue for some people, it's 90% of their
Yeah.
struggle. And you get. I get a lot of clients that come from a significant history of dieting, and their parents were overweight, and their grandparents were overweight, and
Mhm.
they've tried their whole life to get this weight off. But just like I know, when you don't address hormones, you'll lose a little weight no matter what you do. I mean, cutting calories, you'll lose a little weight, but it's going to come back on, and it's going to come back on with vengeance. And so I get so many clients that have had the significant history of yo-yo dieting, and it's really about, okay, well, why hasn't this worked in the past, and what do we need to do different this time to make this stick?
Mhm. Mm. What's your philosophy with, as a ketogenic health coach? What's your principle for your clients?
Yeah. So I think this is a great question. So I think everyone fits into a little bit of a different category. I think it's really easy to look at some of us online and say, okay, like she's a registered dietitian. She only preaches keto and that's the only method.
Mhm.
Sometimes I can't sometimes somebody's worst problem isn't is so much bigger than just that they need to go keto. And so I think really going back to that individualization of looking at each person like their own person with their own
Right.
individual game plans and protocols and action steps and really trying to address the things that are underneath the surface versus,
Mhm.
it's very easy for any coach to spot habits in a diet recall or in
Mhm.
somebody's client assessment. What is more important is figuring out kind of the root causes of all this hormonal dysregulation. How do we get that back so you're not having all
Mhm.
these cravings and you're never feeling full because your insulin is so high? And so my philosophy, I
Mhm.
would say, is to treat every individual like an
Yeah.
individual and figure out what's going to help be most supportive of them in maintaining this long term.
Mhm. Do you think that they have to know how the body works though, for them to be empowered? Because a lot of these are, so much different from what they know from the conventional way, right? And so I think, do you think that educating them on how the body works like this, how we're talking like this, is important for them to, make that, calculated decision every time? Because they're met with a decision. You said, like, is it 200 times, decisions, food decisions a
Yeah.
day? You said.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of decisions to make every single day. So like you said, we can slip up, that's fine, but it has to be like 80-90% of your decisions should be,
In the
for
right
your life
direction.
in the right direction.
Yeah, I definitely think understanding even just the basic physiology of
Mhm.
how do carbs impact blood glucose and what happens once blood glucose is elevated in terms of the pancreas and what happens if you have elevated insulin all the time and how does this drive elevated triglycerides and all these other things I think is very important because it's also good to note too kind of the symptoms of like a lot of people don't realize that insulin resistance can cause depression and anxiety. And
Mm,
they're trying to treat all of these different
yeah.
things and they're not realizing, oh shoot, if I would just take care of one thing, all of these different things will subside. My mental health will be clear. I'll feel better about my body because I'm able to lose weight. My cycle will return, which is like one of the biggest indicators of female health is regular on time normal cycles. And so all of these different things just are so intertwined. But yes, I definitely think explaining, and everybody likes a little bit of a different degree of this, right? Like some people just
Yeah.
want the basics of what's
Mhm.
going on. Some people are like, you better
Yeah,
tell
yeah.
me exactly why my triglycerides are getting elevated in an insulin
Yeah.
resistant state, and I'm fine with that. And I think that understanding those different pathways and mechanisms and metabolic processes are helpful when it comes to understanding why you're doing what you're doing. This is why I really like CGMs as well. I think CGMs or continuous glucose monitors are so helpful because it's so easy to explain to someone, hey, Jane Doe, I'm telling you that that soda is raising your blood glucose and then you're having an insulin response and now you're storing fat. When they slap a CGM on and their insulin goes to 220 or their blood glucose goes to 220, that's a
Yeah.
totally different level of understanding than me just telling them what happens. And now they're, getting an alarm on their phone that's like
Yeah.
your glucose is dangerously high. And so
Mhm.
I think that using some of those tools, I use those in my practice and I think they're incredibly helpful for accountability, but also like it really is helpful to see like
Mhm.
exactly
Yeah.
what's going on in the moment when you make those decisions and that reinforces kind of that those behavior changes as well.
So the CGMs, they're required for all your clients?
They're not required. I don't require my clients to get them just because they have already paid the price of my program and I just
Mhm.
don't want to add additional costs, but I do offer them. I work with a company called Thea Health,
Mhm.
Theia, and they work with practitioners to make CGMs affordable essentially. And
Mm.
so, yeah, I do think that they can be extremely helpful in situations where someone's really trying to tailor their blood glucose and really trying to nail things and tighten things up. And so I think that, yeah, I
Yeah.
do. I don't require them for everyone, but there's definitely certain individuals where I'm like, this would really, really benefit you
Yeah.
if you considered wearing it.
Yeah, and it's learning experience for them too, right? They'll know what type of foods actually spikes blood sugar, right? And
Yep.
then no, you will know that those keto products that you buy from online or in the groceries can spike your blood sugar because those
Yeah.
companies, they don't have your best interest, right? They want to sell
No.
you a product basically.
Yeah.
And
100%.
people come to me, hey, I'm not losing weight on keto. Well, let me see what you're eating, and you'll see that there's a lot of keto products in there that are spiking your blood sugar, in fact, spiking your insulin, which
Yeah.
is which is not what you want, right?
No.
So,
No.
yeah, so like auditing your lifestyle. Do you audit their lifestyle like a week before so you just know how they're eating before you start?
So typically the way that kind of like I like to see stuff is I don't necessarily like if they want to be my client, I'll sign them up to be my client and then we'll start yes, essentially. I like to see like a 2 to 3 day
Yeah.
regular dietary food log before I'll tell them like, okay, this is where the red
Yeah.
flags may be, etc. But so yeah, I essentially I think that I have a really large client assessment. How many hours a night are you sleeping? What's your exercise routine? What are your stress levels?
Mhm.
One thing I think is important to note is, and I learned this from a CGM as well. I mean, I knew it, but seeing this in real time was really important for me. So I wore a CGM, and um, I was really surprised by the kind of secondary things that also raise blood glucose, like living in a stressed out state and or a lack of sleep. And so I think making sure when I'm working with a client that we're looking at those types of things is important as well. Is are you sleeping a lot? Are you stressed out? Do you hate your job? Like what's going on? Lifestyle, like you said, kind of an audit that
Mhm.
what are those things that will raise blood glucose levels and in turn raise insulin, whether it's indirect from cortisol or whatever, and kind of go from there. And I was really surprised. I've gotten a lot of clients that their diet was actually really good, like in terms of low carb, ketogenic, but they were really still struggling. And it's those additional areas
Mm.
that we've got to focus on a little bit more so than the food itself is, oh yeah, you're eating pretty low carb, pretty ketogenic, but you're sleeping for 5 hours every night, and then you go to a job that you hate and you're really stressed out and your blood pressure is elevated all day. Like that's going to pay off in the wrong way when it comes to cortisol and insulin. So yeah, lifestyle's huge
Mm.
when it comes to this.
So for your clients, what's something that um is most surprising to them that flies under the radar that they're most surprised about? Um, when you audit their lifestyle, what's the one thing that they're always surprised about?
I would say stress and sleep would be number
Mhm.
1,
Mhm.
in terms of the effects of that on weight
Right.
loss and lifestyle. I would say the second one, and this is maybe a little off, but I would say dairy. I
Mhm.
think a lot of people start keto and they think that it is just an unlimited excuse to eat as much dairy as you want.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of times clients are surprised to hear me tell them, like, you really need to be cautious with. I'm not anti dairy by any means, but I am like in certain conditions, like if you've got PCOS, limiting dairy could potentially be helpful. I'm cognizant on the type of dairy and, are you doing dairy for every meal? Is that really necessary? So
Mhm.
I think that is one thing. I should say dairy, I would say fat in general. I think
Mhm.
sometimes people switch to keto and they just think, "Oh, I can eat as much fat as I want,"
Yeah.
and that will get you into trouble really quick.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, wow, that's amazing. So I want last point here. What do you think is required for somebody to make a change? One thing, if you were to boil it down to one thing. I know there's a
I
lot of
would
things. One thing.
Yeah, I would say just sheer determination.
Mm.
Like if you're determined to do it, you will do it no matter what challenges, no matter what
Mhm.
barriers, no matter what gets in your
Mhm.
way, you will find a way around
Mhm.
it. And everyone has a different level of that, right?
Yeah.
But I would say there are a lot of things that influence the determination, but that is definitely something that I have seen in my best clients in terms of keeping the weight off long term, losing,
Mhm.
over 150 pounds. Those types of things is it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter what party or birthday or holiday or special event at work. Like I am determined to make a
Right.
change. And so I
Mhm.
would say that's the number one quality
Mhm.
that I've
Yeah.
seen in people.
I want to get your opinion on this because I always tell people when somebody comes to you and asks you, "Hey, why you're not eating that?" And I always tell them, you can just tell them that, I just choose not to have that right now because I'm on a journey and this is my journey. And you feel, and you will find that people are can be reasoned with, right? And they'll understand. But it's not to say that you can't have those things, those foods, right? Once in a while, right? But right now you're on a diet, you're on a journey, you're on a health journey, you're trying to heal,
Yeah.
and you just choose not to have it right now, right? Instead of
Yeah.
just, oh, I can't have that. Like, you're restricting yourself of all these foods. You know, um, you know, fairly enough that sometimes can be very very dangerous for your health, right? But right now, you just choose not to. Just the wording, right? I think helps a lot of people. Um,
100%.
right. So what
Yeah,
do you
I
think
would
about?
say well, I like that you mentioned the word choose because I think
Mhm,
the one word I discourage my clients to
mhm.
say is can't. I can't have that. I can't do that. I can't,
Yep.
can't. I think that can get you into a restriction mindset of like, I'm so restricted. This is terrible. And then you're going to binge from it. I really
Mhm,
like that you mentioned the word choose. I think that that's exactly what I encourage my clients to do. Say something along those lines. Like, I'm choosing not to have that because it doesn't fit my goals. I'm choosing not to have that because it doesn't necessarily make me feel
yeah.
good. I'm choosing. And so that really puts the power in the individual and it empowers them to be in control, which I
Mhm,
feel like is one of the bigger issues alongside of this is a lot of people feel out of control with food. A lot of people feel like they're a slave to food and or can't break the chains of food. And so when you use wording like that, it's very empowering for that individual
mm.
to feel like they're the ones taking the reins. They're the one in control and deciding where their health journey is going to take them, which I think is a big deal.
Awesome. Well, Temple, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. Where can people find you if they want to work with you, Temple?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for having me on. This was fun. So, if you need to find me or want to find me, I'm on basically every platform as the.ketogenic.nutritionist. I'm on YouTube, I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok. I would say if you have a specific question, follow me on Instagram and DM me there. It's where I'm most active. But yeah, find me on those channels. And I also have a very small podcast, not anything like this one, but you can find me on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well.
Thank you, Temple, for coming on and sharing your story here with us today. Really appreciate you for spending your time here, your precious time here with us. So thank you, Temple. I appreciate you.
Yeah, you bet. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome.